All right, we'll call the meeting to order. It is just after 7 o'clock on May 25th. Our first order of business is a moment of reflection before we get into the approval of the agendas. So we'll start with a moment of reflection and then carry on with the agenda. All right. So first order of business is our consent agenda. Does anyone have any questions on the consent agenda?
Yes, I do, Your Worship. I'd like to bring item 3, flood from Alberta government in regards to provincial parks and the community.
You would like to which, sorry?
Bring that forward onto our regular agenda, just to discuss that, just to...
Okay. Anything else on the consent agenda? There's a few items of information regarding ICFs for Stavely, some info from AUMA, so a little bit of everything. If there's nothing else, a motion to approve the consent agenda with the exception of the one item being pulled into the regular agenda.
So move, Your Worship.
Councillor Dressler makes that motion. Called question, all in favor? Any opposed? Motion carried. All right, moving on to regular meeting agenda. If we add number 10 to be the item we just pulled from the consent agenda. Is there any other questions on the agenda? Seeing none, a motion from council to approve the agenda with one addition. Councillor Monteith makes the motion. Called question, all in favor? Any opposed? Motion carried. We have an opportunity here for council to be able to share any comments or happenings that they've seen or reflections for the good of council. Does anyone have something they'd like to share? Councillor Monteith.
On Friday, the Housing Committee met with Roger Reed and went over the needs of the town, the concerns, and just what the province might be thinking. So it was a good meeting. What comes of it, who knows, but he knows where we're coming from anyway.
Very good. Thank you. Anyone else?
Our Community Crime Prevention had a meeting here at the town of Fort Macleod. That went very well. Sergeant Brian Muha, along with the corporal, was there as well. So kudos again to the town of Fort Macleod administration staff and the RCMP for working on this project together. And I'm looking forward to continuing and seeing what happens from that.
All right, thank you. Anyone else have comments? Councillor Dressler, yeah.
One of the youth programs, which is in the community of Fort Macleod and in Kainai and also in southern Alberta, is the Army Cadet program along with Air and Sea. Because of youth having an opportunity this summer, so they've sent contracts out for the youth between the ages of 12 and 19 that have applied for camp. And so they'll be working at the facilities while during the summer to maintain and look after them and actually get paid.
All right. I know from a community perspective, it's good to see the ability for many of our local stores to be open again. Even a couple new ones that were trying to start before COVID, but now they're able to open. So um, that's been very encouraging to see. More people getting out and into the community. So that's always good to see. Other than that, I have nothing. So if there is none other from council, we will move on to new business. We have item 1, which is a presentation or discussion that CEO Keenan will lead. I will pass it over to you.
Thank you, Mayor Fader, and good evening, Council. As Council's aware, for the last few months, we've been dealing with a significant increase in crime in the town of Fort Macleod, as well as what I term delinquent housing. In discussions with some of the key stakeholders that were recently involved in the drug bust down on 11th Street, it's my opinion that we should create a task force that deals with our safe communities. We do have a vast array of different people, key stakeholders, that have agreed to sit on that task force. I have two kind of thoughts about having council representation on the task force. I could go either way. But tonight, the recommendation, the rationale, some of the draft documentation is attached to your package, which I hope you've had a chance to read. But the recommendation from administration tonight is that council approves the appointment of one councillor to sit on the Safe Communities Task Force with the intent of commencing meetings in June. The date has been set and everybody is confirmed. Also wanted to indicate that we've added one more key stakeholder. Conrad Van Herden from the Crime Prevention Committee will also sit on that committee, or the task force, I mean. So that's it, unless there's any specific questions. I think the submission is pretty clear. Thank you.
Any opening questions from council regarding this? So the recommendation right now is that council approves the appointment of one councillor.
If you believe it's necessary.
Pardon me?
If you believe it's necessary as a council, you might want to have that discussion first.
Okay.
I'm of two minds on that.
So your suggestion is it's not 100% required that a council member
Correct.
sits on the committee, but it's okay if one does?
Yep, absolutely.
Okay. And is there a motion required for the commissioning of such task force, or is that
That's an administrative function at this point, but definitely a motion if council wants a councillor to sit on it, that would need to be a motion.
So just the one motion you're looking for. Okay, is there any comments from council on this for or against the appointment of a council member to sit on this task force? Councillor?
I have a question. Better. I just have a question as to the opinion of CEO Keenan of that you don't think a councillor needs to sit on there. If this is something that is a big part of the community with many stakeholders, I think it should have a seat. I'm just curious why you're of the impression that we necessarily don't have a seat at the table. Like how do we as a council get involved unless administration is directly involved?
I concur with your comment 100%. That's why I'm kind of two minds. I will be on that committee, of course, and I am a liaison to council. But if council wants more of the political view with respect to that task force, then that's where I see that role coming into play. With respect to an appointment of a councillor, I see that very much as being a champion for the community as a whole, in addition to being that representative that has an opportunity to talk quite a bit to council. Being an advocate for the citizens based on our strategic plan is very important. It's a priority, as council established a few years ago. So there's a lot of pros and cons for both.
Okay. Coming to the meeting, I was more of thinking that we needed to appoint one, so now questioning whether we need one or not isn't something I had considered before. Does anyone else have some comments on this? Councillor Edwards?
After doing some research and reading all of the information that was included with this, I actually asked CAO Keenan today whether she thought that a counselor was necessary. Not that we shouldn't be there, but I wonder if we might muddy the waters and slow things up rather than let them get down to work. We have a great CAO who does a great job of keeping us informed, and I don't necessarily feel like we need another person who's paid to be sitting at another meeting. So on the other hand, I also feel very strongly about the safe communities, and as a counselor who's had many individuals from our community talk to me about our recent uptake in unsavory incidents in town, it's something I'm very interested in and very passionate about getting a handle on and hopefully reducing in our community. So I understand the not necessarily needing a counselor on there, and at the same time feel that if a counselor is going to be appointed to it, it needs to be somebody who is there purely for the community voice rather than, I mean, there's some great people who are on this committee who have some amazing expertise, and we don't need to replicate that because they're already there. So hopefully it'll, go either way. I'm fine either way, whether somebody sits on it or not. But it's something that I think needs to move forward. It needs to move forward quickly. And so I, kind of wonder one way or the other what we need to be doing as a council.
Very well. Councillor Dressler?
I'm in the same opinion with the CAO. I read over it. I applaud her and Sergeant Brian Mulhall along with other delegates. And I think that this is a step in the right direction. And I also am a very large advocate in reducing crime within our community. And I think that this is a positive influence on the community. And I think the other thing is that this will reflect very well if we let our administration do it and run this as a sole, unless there is a need for a counselor to be there. I don't think there is a need for a council member to be sitting on there, because then it just becomes more muddied by politics.
Very well. Any other comments? Councillor Wilson?
Somebody asked me, is this open to the public to join this, or is this is all who's going to be on it?
No, it's not open to the public. It's key stakeholders that are involved predominantly with enforcement, law enforcement. Yep. And then, of course, the town with respect to our bylaw enforcement.
Thank you.
Councillor Ward?
I applaud the administration for their initiative in putting together this group and seeking to address these issues that are intended to be addressed. Clearly, we want to address that. We want to have a safer community. There are pockets of issues in the town, and I think that taking this broad approach is the best chance that we have to try to address those in a meaningful way. So again, I applaud the administration for the efforts made to put this together. As has been mentioned, I too would probably lean towards not having a counselor on the committee. I see much of what this committee will do as an administrative function. There's significant expertise that's included in the body that's presented to us. Obviously, there will be initiatives that will come back to council that will need our input on, and I have no concerns about being kept apprised as to what's being presented by the committee. So I, again, sustain the initiative, but I would probably lean towards not needing a counselor on this committee.
Okay, very good. Anyone else? Councillor Rivas?
So as I previously mentioned, I wasn't coming into this. I was just reading the recommendation, which was we have to prove somebody. So, but based on the information and the conversation, I'm definitely for keeping it limited to CEO Keenan representing council's interests.
CEO Keenan?
Thank you, Mayor Fader. One last point I'd like to make is the updates, which will be regular to council to definitely keep you in the loop, may not always be at a regular council meeting due to the ongoing operations that will be occurring in the town of Fort Macleod. They will be coming to you in camera. That's just to maintain the integrity of ongoing investigations. So just a heads up on that.
One question I have, CEO Keenan, if you could, if there's feedback that council has on certain situations, crime, derelict properties, whatever they might be, what clarity do we have? And that's not just council members, that's citizens as a whole. What will that be discussed in this task force, and how to get that feedback, how to use it, how to ensure that it's going somewhere?
To be truthful with you, we're getting a lot of feedback already. So I would encourage all of the community and every resident and business in the community of the town of Fort Macleod, if there are issues that you suspect there's something happening that's not quite kosher with the community standards we have in the town of Fort Macleod, by all means, feel free to call myself or Lisa Gillingham as the Director of Community and Protective Services. Or Wes Noble, our bylaw enforcement officer, who will also be on this task force. We need everybody's collective voice in this community to get on top of this. We can't do it on our own. This committee's not going to, or this task force will not be able to address everything or every issue unless we are informed and we can make educated, very well decided decisions. So we need everyone in the community to pull together on this initiative and to basically indicate to specifically drug dealers and delinquent homeowners that enough is enough. We are going to put things in place that are going to be either one, very financially punitive, and or people are going to go to jail.
Okay. I appreciate that. So I think you've done some media discussions with our local news Macleod Gazette. I was curious if you're getting all the feedback, or Lisa, I'm just wondering if we start intentionally trying to encourage people to always call it in to you or Lisa or Wes. I'm just wanting to make sure that we're not going to lose, because it could be a lot.
Yeah.
And I don't know that we've publicly invited people to phone in with that information.
That's a very valid point, and I'm just thinking about all the calls I've already taken. I would like to rephrase my last comment then to encourage our residents to contact their councillors first and share their concerns with them, and then council can parlay them on to us, and we can deal with them we'll do them as we do every other complaint, which is written. We can't take anything anonymously. It has to be, somebody actually has to put their name to it, so that we can follow up with them and make sure we've got the complaint written exactly the way that they've suggested it be written, and or they've written it themselves. So if council could help out in that regard, I think that would really speed up our process, number one, and number two, it would sure help us capture all of the comments and complaints we're currently getting.
Yeah, and I probably question that method a little bit, because I don't know that councillors want to take. I'm just wondering if there would be a hotline, or I'm not sure what it would be, but
Would
Councillor Orr, go ahead.
Would there be some value in the task force meeting and collectively addressing their minds to how can they receive information from the community and put forward a recommendation? I too have a little bit of concern about directing all of that information to come first to a councillor and then us to relay that to a member of the committee, yourself or Lisa, that seems, I'm not sure. So I'm wondering if maybe the task force itself might just address that issue as to how they think would be the best way to solicit the information from our community, and then make a decision from there.
That's a wonderful idea, and absolutely, we have a meeting coming up, I believe it's June 16th, our first one, and that can be added to our already created agenda. So that would be great.
Well, and I believe council still is free to make sure administration is getting feedback that we hear. That's part of our role. So if we hear anything, I'll definitely, and we all should, be passing that on. I think just making sure we have some kind of a structure behind it so that it's people feel like and know that their voices are heard. Okay. Any other questions? So based on my feelings and feedback from council, it doesn't sound like we want an appointment.
Just one other question, on the task force, on your recommendation, you've got legal counsel representative TBD. So has the decision been made to have legal counsel attend each of the meetings? And I'm assuming then that would be a paid, or would the legal counsel simply be legal counsel that you seek legal opinions from when those legal opinions are needed? So I guess, long and short, could you explain why you feel like you need to have legal counsel in attendance at each of your meetings, assuming that's what's implied by the recommendation?
And that's why it's TBD. We're not expecting we'll have legal counsel at every meeting for that length of time, only because they charge so much. It will be based on whether we need a legal opinion or not on a collective strategy for how we're going to tackle each issue or several issues.
As required. Okay. Any further questions or discussion? So you need no motion at this time? So seeing no motion from council, then we will, I think, maybe ask for a motion to accept this information, just so it's on the record that we dealt with it. Councillor Dressler. Called question, all in favor? Any opposed? Motion carried. Carrying on to asset management cohort, Director of Operations Adrian Pedro.
Thank you, Mayor Fader. So this submission is pretty simple. We're asking council to support administration's endeavor into asset management. So as you would have read, the FCM released another round of funding for an asset management cohort. We were approached by the town of Pincher Creek, who's trying to lead the efforts for a bunch of small municipalities. I believe 8 of us at this point to participate in this cohort. So one of the requirements that FCM has is that we have a council motion, excuse me, as it was written, showing council support for us to apply for this asset management cohort. So that's what we're asking for tonight.
Councillor Dressler.
Your worship, I read over this and I'm willing to make the motion that the town of Fort Macleod participate in this cohort, asset management.
As per the recommendation.
As per the recommendation, yes.
Thank you very much. Any further discussion or questions? Councillor Monteith.
When we had a presentation from whoever we got to do that thing before, it was totally different than what we thought we were getting. So I guess I just want to make sure that I understand what we're getting out of this, because in my mind, the purpose of the asset management is to list the assets, list their life, determine when they need to be replaced so that we have a plan for the future for all these capital items. So is this what's going to come out of this? Do you know?
Yeah, that's the intent at this point. So the idea of the cohort is to actually meet with these stakeholders and discuss what our needs are compared to what was presented at the time. I wasn't here, but I did read over what was presented, and that didn't apply for smaller jurisdictions. So this cohort would determine that and then would also look into what strategies are needed for smaller towns. So the intent, at least the way I see it, and the director of finance as well, is to get something that's more tangible for us. So not so much focused on what was presented earlier, but actually focusing on what we have in town.
Well, if that's what's gonna happen, I'm all for it, because we really need to get on this, because we have to know what's ahead of us. We've been going by the seat of our pants, so to speak, for a while here, and this year it sort of caught up to us a little bit, and it could really catch up to us in the future unless we're prepared, so I'm all in favor.
Yeah, for sure. I appreciate that commentary. Just so you guys know, we're making some decent strides as a town for asset management, at least from the public works side. So we already have some GPS equipment in use, just documenting everything. We're developing systems in place to actually track some of our infrastructure. So we're on the right track. So this will certainly help.
All right, any other comments, questions?
I would just like to echo the comments of Councillor Monteith. We've all agreed that getting an asset management plan in place is something that we support and encourage. So with this initiative, if we're moving in that direction and we're going to get something of value out of it, then I'm absolutely in support of it. And if there's some outside funding to facilitate that, that's all the more reason to take advantage of it at this time. So good to see this initiative coming forward.
Very well. All right, if there's no further discussion, we'll call it the question. All in favor? Any opposed? Motion carried. Carrying on to item 3, year-to-date financials presented by Director of Finance Chris Holbeck.
Good evening, Council. The first item on the agenda for this evening is our year-to-date financials. There's not a ton to talk about. We've put in the tax revenue and there's expenses year-to-date. I don't know if anyone has questions. I didn't have anything that I really wanted to highlight.
Okay, motion to accept this information. Councillor Edwards makes a motion. Is there any questions from council regarding the year-to-date? Councillor Monteith?
I'm assuming that the reason why some of the wages look out of whack is because you're plunking everything into one account and then break it out into the other accounts later, and that's why it looks like we've overexpended on wages?
That's correct. Our pension and our benefits all go into the same lump accounts and I break them out. I try to do it in September, but I usually get to it for year end.
Any other questions? Seeing none, called to question. All in favor? Any opposed? Motion carried.
Thank you.
Moving on then to administration, we have local improvement tax policy, Director of Finance Chris Holbeck.
This is back on the agenda for tonight. We spoke about this at Committee of the Whole last week, and we're quite fortunate that we have a counselor who can write policy very well and understands it and helped us revise it to have more of a policy that is overarching for this, for the local improvement taxes. So I think it's a better policy, and we will be using it as a guide in the future for some of our policy writing.
Anyone prepared to make a motion to accept this as to approve or to accept? Always not sure how that one should go. Approve this local improvement tax policy as presented. Councillor Wolstenholme makes the motion. Any further discussion? Questions? Seeing none, we'll call it the question. All in favor? Any opposed? Motion carried. Moving on then to bylaw 1915, which is a bylaw to finance the Southwest Industrial Utility Upgrade. Director of Finance Chris Holbeck.
Thank you again, Mayor Fader. As council knows, we spoke at capital budgeting time. The Southwest Southwest Industrial Utility Upgrade Phase 1 project is to be funded via capital grants, our MSI and our federal gas tax fund, and the portion that is not grant funded is to be funded from our reserves. So I don't know exactly which council meeting we spoke about this at, but there was discussions about self-financing the unfunded portion of this project. And I don't know how I got it into my head, but I had gotten it into my head that the pool project would be funded from reserves, but it would not be self-financed. So it wouldn't be paid back to reserves. Reserves would just pay for it. So I started with the Southwest Industrial funding bylaw, self-financing bylaw, because it has to be done by bylaw. So I guess we should have a discussion about this, because I may have just gotten ahead of myself by deciding that we weren't doing this type of a self-financing for the pool project and just for the Southwest Industrial one. So I'm going to hand it back to you to start the conversation.
So for tonight, we would like minimum some discussion on bylaw 1915 with some indication on pool financing. Is that what you're asking?
Yes, I'd just like to know if I erred by deciding that we were just financing the pool project via reserve with no repayment.
Okay.
So I need some direction, please.
Okay. So perhaps is anyone prepared to make a motion for first reading on bylaw 1915, and then we can have some discussion? Councillor Edwards makes the motion for first reading on bylaw 1915. Okay. Discussion. Does anyone have any comments, questions regarding this bylaw? Councillor Edwards.
What happens if we go ahead with this bylaw, but then we get additional funding, either federally or provincially, that magically appears? Does it change the bylaw? Do we have to come and make adjustments to it, or can we just carry on and fund whatever is remaining by ourselves?
If we by chance got some additional grant funding, which made our reserve portion less, we would have to either amend or rescind this one.
Or apply it to another project.
Or apply it to another project.
Any other questions, comments on this bylaw? Councillor Orr, I know you had some questions on bylaw 1915.
Yeah. I was considering, and it comes up again a little bit later, the scenario that we have right now where it's very cheap to borrow money. We agreed to a line of credit a council or two ago where it made sense not to cash in an investment from our reserves because we were getting 3% or thereabouts on that reserve investment, and the line of credit was 1.95. So it made perfect sense not to draw from our reserves to pay a debt that we could pay with a line of credit. And so as I look at this, and again, I know this is just a new question for us with respect to self-financing, I just wonder whether there is opportunity, and I'm not suggesting that a line of credit is the way that we would borrow on this, but if capital was available to be borrowed at a lesser rate than what we're getting on our reserves right now, wouldn't it make sense to borrow that money, pay the lesser rate, keep our reserves earning a little bit of a higher rate, and allow that interest from an external source to come into the pot as opposed to charging our ratepayers that 1 or 2 or 3% that's being proposed in this bylaw? And so I know that it depends on the availability of such funding, but I just wondered whether or not that should be explored, and maybe it has been. I noticed there was a brief response to that, and So I just raised that as to whether or not that's another possibility of financing this. And again, it's simply because of the circumstances that we're in. That external 3% or 2.5 or whatever percent that we're getting from an external investment, that's interest that we're getting externally, and it's not coming from our ratepayers. And I think that's something to consider. So any kind of further explanation on that would be appreciated. And I know, Ms. Holbeck, that you provided some of that, but maybe you could address that.
So the question came up from Councillor Orr today. So I just kind of did a little bit of analysis for council. Out of our reserves, they're all invested in investments. I've invested in the town's portfolio. I've invested some of our funds in long-term investments. So those investments total about $6 million, and they mature in 2025 through 2029. So they don't mature in the near future. And those are the ones that are getting us around the 3% return. So I also have invested our funds in shorter term funds. So when we got the payout from Fortis, I knew that council was considering using that for a capital project. So I didn't invest it in the long-term funds like the other $6 million. I put it in something shorter because I figured we'd need the cash flow at a sooner date. So I had them invested, and it's about $6.5 million. So it's a Fortis money and a little bit of extra money that we had floating around. So those investments mature November of this year, and they're getting the town a return of between 2.08 and 2.15% right now. So my thought was these investments would be the ones that we would cash in when they come due in November to pay for some of the capital projects that we're working on in the 2020 capital budget. I didn't put them into the long-term 5-year farther out timelines because I figured we were going to utilize those funds. I was planning that when we start the capital projects, these investments won't have cashed in yet. So my thought was we would utilize the line of credit to kind of give us the cash flow in between now or when those capital projects start and when those investments mature and we can cash them in and pay ourselves back. So I'm not sure. I looked up on the Alberta Capital Finance Authority's website today just to see what kind of an external interest rate they're charging. And they are charging, so they don't have a 40 or a 50-year term. Their longest for ACFA is 30-year term, and they are charging 2.5039% currently. So what the external, and those are the best rates that we can get normally for a municipality. So 2.5039% interest is higher than what we're getting on those investments currently. And I wanted the line of credit to be kind of a liquidity thing. So we're deferring taxes and we're deferring utilities this year, and we're going to be in a little bit of a cash crunch probably closer to the end or September-ish when people start paying for those kinds of bills. So I really wanted the line of credit to be kind of just a temporary thing. We can use it and then we pay it back when people start to pay their taxes and their utilities to the town. I wasn't thinking of it as a long-term financing option because line of credits, the interest can change. It can be quite variable. It's not fixed at any time. So if we use something like a line of credit to pay for capital projects, the interest rate could increase. And if we have $5 million in there, it could get quite costly for the town. So I'd never really thought about the line of credit for that type of thing. And then for other types of external financing, I just looked to the ACFA to see if it was more palatable than if it made sense to borrow from them versus taking money out of our investments. But currently, those investments that I talked about, there's about $6.5 million in there, and they're getting between, I said, 2.08 and 2.15 right now. So I'll take some questions.
Councillor Monteith.
I think when you're looking at the comparison of what you're earning and what you're paying, with interest rates going down, when these investments mature, they're not going to get the same rate that you got when you invested them 6 months ago. So you've got to compare what the interest rates are going to be on that versus what we're getting on our investments. So it's, you know, it's a crapshoot right now because who knows what's going to happen with rates. I mean, interest rates are historically low now, but the other side of the coin is income you earn is going to be historically low, because if you can earn more than you're paying, everyone in the world will do that, and that never happens. So I think we have to look at what we can earn on that money in the future, not what we're earning now, and compare that to what we're paying to determine whether it makes sense to leave the investments in or not.
So that's a good point. And what I was thinking of was the reason that there's this opportunity cost that we talk about between the 3% that we're getting on those long-term investments versus the 1.9 that they want to charge us for our line of credit. The opportunity cost is because we invested that money in those long-term assets a while back when the market was good. So that's the discrepancy, and it's probably not going to happen like that again. So I don't know, I lost my train of thought, sorry.
Councillor Venables.
Well, I second Councillor Monteith's comment, is that the projected rate right now, if we were to lock in 3, 4, 5, that's the number that's missing to this equation, because we're using something that was done, you know, before all of this, before these low income rates. But if we're taking this 6 million that's in low interest, or in short term, and we want a buffer, so let's say we take 2 million and leave it in short term again, and we take the 4 million and put it into a 5 or 60 month investment, it's not guaranteed that we're going to get 3%. It could be 2.018. It could, and then it's a wash, and then we still got to pay fees for when we do borrow, and you know, there's a lot of additional costs to borrowing money.
So I believe there's a motion on the floor. Councillor Edwards, did you specify in your motion which percentage rate?
No, I sure didn't. I just said as
Would you
recommended.
like to? I think the bylaw is currently written with the 1%. And that's a discussion we can have as well. That's two parts that we need to discuss. Any other comments on this? I know this is a first for our community. It's not an easy one to comprehend or understand. In many ways, I don't think we can go wrong in a sense, because if you borrow from yourself and pay it back with interest, it's going to be better than borrowing externally. And so in a sense, that money we're paying it back to ourselves. So in the end, it's a balance. The question whether to just pay cash and not worry about financing or paying back with interest, I think there's value in paying back to interest if we work our reserve funds down to an uncomfortable level. That's not where we want to be. So if we can use that and pay it back with interest, I think it helps us appreciate the value of reserves and use that money in ways that lost my train of thought, sorry.
The only way that we would maintain a wash or balance is if we maintain the cost of borrowing in the bylaw equivalent to the return on investment. That's the only way we have an absolute zero on in or out. The fact that we can only borrow, that our amortization can only be 30 years is a speculation, especially when we're looking to borrow for 50. But my opinion is if we do an internal finance, or we proceed with this bylaw, that we have to investigate what we can generate and use that exact rate in our bylaw. that to me would make the most sense and be a balance, a healthy balance.
Councillor Orr.
One of the things that I think is important for us to consider here is where we're getting our return on that investment. If we collapse the reserve, we give up the return coming from an external source. If we borrow from ourselves, our return comes from our ratepayers, right? And so I would be curious, Ms. Holbeck has said that ACFA currently offers a 30-year term at 2.5039. If we were to take that $5 million, which is currently kind of up for grabs, the Southwest Industrial and the pool, if we were to self-finance, but so if we were to take that $5 million and say, what can we get on that $5 million in an investment over 30 years? And here we are today, we should be able to find out what that is. That's not a speculation. And if we were to get an investment of 2.5 or even 2.3, where it's very close, that's interest money that's coming from an external source. It's not coming from our taxpayer. And that interest then, the investment pays the interest portion. Obviously, we're still going to need to pay back the principal, right? But that's no different whether we self-finance through borrowing against our own reserves or whether we borrow externally. We'll still have to pay back the principal. And so even if the return rates and the interest rates are close, it still seems advantageous to me to have that interest coming from an external source rather than that interest coming from our ratepayers.
Councillor Penagos.
I can appreciate that, but that speaks to one side of the conversation. That speaks to the investment, the investment generated by the reserve. We also need to take into consideration the rent or the interest that is due on our borrowings, which we will be doing if we do not self-finance. So at the end of the day, a wash is if you can, whatever you can generate by investing your reserves is what you charge the taxpayer. But to say that we're getting revenue based on the investment is correct, but that's half of the equation. The other equation is that we now have to borrow at 2.5, which is for 30 years, which could be low compared to the next 20. That's the risk. But the other risk, which in my mind is higher, is that interest rates go lower and our investment has a lower return in 5 years, because that's 10 times that we have to renew that long-term investment. So there's arguments for and against, but to say that it's better to get that revenue in based on our investment, that's only half the picture in my mind, because then we still have to borrow at 2.5 or whatever the rate was. That to me balances out the investment return.
So, Councillor Orr, how are you? Would you be suggesting? Are you suggesting that we pull money from reserves?
I would be suggesting, and again, I'll give it some further consideration, but in my mind, if we can lock in a loan for 30 years at 2.5%, and we can lock in an investment for 30 years at an equivalent amount, that covers our costs of interest on that loan. And we don't have to increase and get that money from our ratepayers. So I don't know whether we can finance in that way, or
Okay, Councillor Monteith.
I don't think you can lock an investment in for 30 years, though, can you? They're uncertain about what's going to happen in 3 to 5 years, let alone 30 years. That would be what I would question.
so that, yeah, absolutely. That's I'm curious to know what length of investment we could invest for, and what certainty do we have there. And again, at that point, if we can only secure this proper mix for 10 years or 15 years, well, that's 10 or 15 years where we have that proper mix. And then at the end of that 10 or 15 years, then we deal with it as we need to.
I would think that interest rates in the next 15 years are going to go up. If you can lock it in at 2.5, then you're gambling that the investment is going to make more than that once things turn around and whatever. You know, and that's hard to say. I mean, if I was a betting man, I'd bet that interest rates are going to go up over the next 15, 20 years. But we've been saying that for the last 10, 15 years, so I don't know what that means.
Well, yeah, there's a lot of different scenarios in something like this. You can go back and forth for quite some time trying to figure out which best scenario. Councillor Dressler?
This more a question towards Councilor Monteith and Chris. What is the average interest rate that's out there? Like, I'm only asking, like, on reserves, numbers get thrown out, 2.5%. That's, to me, that's a little high when you think about what our federal reserves look like, what they have at percentage rates, what they're investing at. Is there actually something that is at a municipal rate or a provincial standard that we can look at? Because 2.5, like I said, seems to be a little high.
I have not seen a standard for municipalities for borrowing. It's based on the instrument that you're putting your money into. It's based on the bank. It's based on the term. We have an investment policy here at the town of Fort Macleod where we will only invest in, I think it's AAA plus investments, and that's per the Municipal Government Act. And so we are investing in corporations like banks for long-term bonds. We're investing in corporations that are very well known and very reputable, like TELUS. And we're, for the long-term ones where we're in for 5 years or more, we're getting that 3%. So with the short-term or investing that I've done, we're getting closer to 2. And we actually went into that one with the 2 before COVID hit. So that was our Fortis money, and we invested it when we got it, and COVID hadn't hit yet. So I can't imagine what they're going to be offering for investments in the future. And I don't think they'll let us go 30 years. I could look into it and kind of get some variables and do some back and forth math, absolutely, because this is a big decision for the town of Fort Macleod. We don't want to make the wrong one.
Councillor Edwards?
Can I get an investment lesson? Because I don't really understand how it all works. But if we invest money and we lock it in, we get that interest rate for the entire length of the investment? Or you can invest in both a fixed or variable interest? You know, like, I'm just not sure how it works. Like, are we guaranteed that payout, that percentage growth on our money when you invest, I guess is my question.
So for the type of investments that the town is involved in, it's long-term bonds or shorter-term bonds. We have a little bit of money in cash, just because there's a little bit of cash in some of our investments. And we do a little tiny bit of mutual funds, but they're all with high-end corporations. So when we lock into a bond with a bank or TELUS or whoever, they give us a rate, and it's a 5-year bond, and that's the rate we get. Doesn't matter what happens outside in the real world. We're getting the 5% on that bond, or whatever it is, 3.
Right. Anyone else have any comments? Councillor Dressler?
So can you indulge us by looking into that, Ms. Holbeck, into what interest rates are and what is our best bang for a buck? I would just like to see some figures and something like that. So again, kudos to you, great work. I appreciate you there, but I'd like to see some numbers on what percentages that we'd be investing at.
Councillor Monteith?
I think it depends on the risk factor we're willing to take. Right now, if we self-finance, we're gonna be making 2.509 or whatever that percentage is, because that's what we would have to borrow at, so that's what we're gonna make. So we've got that for 50 years. Question is, are rates gonna go up or not? Well, that's a gamble. They could go up and we could get mucked up big time. So the question is, how much risk are we willing to take on behalf of our citizens on that type of deal? And I'm thinking we should be pretty risk adverse on this, because we're gambling what interest are gonna do over the next 30 years, and I defy anyone to know what they're gonna do. So from my perspective, I think we have to be conservative on this, and we'll be making 2.59% on this money by self-financing. Because I don't know how you can come up with any numbers to justify, doing that. No one knows.
Okay. So are you speaking in favor of this bylaw with the 1%, 2%, or 3%?
I think it should be 2% because that mirrors what we would be borrowing if we did it from an outside perspective.
50 years?
Yep.
Okay. Councillor Venagos?
Do we have to decide the actual rate today? Because without the information at what we would invest at, that to me would be the number, because it may be a decimal point or two back, but on this amount of money, that's a lot of interest over time. And this bylaw is something we're planning on putting in effect for a long, long time. So the difference between 2 or 2.2 is substantial. And if we can generate 2.2 on an investment, I just think we have the ability to make that a wash going in. That would make the most sense. But that's my position on it.
There's just something to remember. This idea of it being an investment and getting a 2 or a 2.5, that's just money coming from our taxpayer. We just need to remember that. And we could charge 5%, and that's just money that we're going to have to get from our taxpayer.
And going back to the taxpayer. Don't forget, right?
Well, today's taxpayer will pay, and tomorrow's taxpayer will enjoy the benefit.
Right, kind of
Right.
reverse of what typically happens with taxes, or with taxes, right? Right, so I think there's some merit to it where we know that the money we're paying in interest is actually revenue toward the same taxpayer.
It is if you look at it as a single side. But when you put the investment and the expense, or when you do the investment and the project together, it's because you got to generate it to pay it, right? So you just have to look at this as a step away, that the reserve account is the bank, and there really is no difference. You need to generate, you need to collect it from the taxpayer to pay it if you borrow it, correct? That's your position, Councillor Orr. But at the same time, if we don't collect it, we're doing the same thing. Like I just think we're going back and forth on, and we agree to the issue that you're saying we'll get it, or the expense, sorry, the revenue will offset the expense, the revenue on the investment, correct? Because if we...
The interest expense.
The interest expense, that's right. The interest revenue will offset the interest expense.
Mm-hmm.
But that's technically what we're arguing on our position as well. But we're retaining the revenue of the interest, if that makes any sense.
I think I want to pull back to the actual bylaw itself. This is first reading. If I understand correct, second and third reading, we can still adjust the term or the interest rate or what have you, and we can ask for additional information regarding what rate is best, whether it's better to go to a shorter term. That's something we can discuss as well at the next meeting. Councillor Edwards?
I guess I'm still a little foggy about how all this works. I'm not a money person and numbers aren't my friend. But in my mind, and I like to make things simple, and I guess my position is I thought we would self-finance it, like we would use our own reserve money to finance it so that we would pay less interest than what we would do if we financed it externally, so that our ratepayers were actually having to pay less interest over time so that it's less of a burden on our ratepayers. I thought that was the whole purpose of self-financing. So if the bank's going to charge us 2%, we would self-finance it at 1.5%. So we're getting that bit of a break on the financing part of it, and then our ratepayers are paying less. And yet we still get to reap the benefit of us, of the town, the municipality, getting that interest payment. And please correct me if my brain did not put that down correctly. Is that right?
Oh, that's right.
Okay, well then I think we should do that.
Before you take into the revenue aspect, because on the asset side of the balance sheet, when you get the revenue generated by the investment, you're losing that now if you use your own money, if you self-finance. So that's why if one rate is higher than the other, it benefits, and that's why you would want the rate to be equivalent, at least going in as long as you can for 5 or 6 years.
But if our investment is maturing and coming out of it anyways, and now all the interest rates are bogus because of COVID and everything, then we should just be as conservative as possible, borrow from ourselves, save ourselves the interest hike that potentially is coming, and save that risk as far as I'm concerned. But like I said, money, balance sheets, this is not my ball game.
All right, so is Councillor
So going forward, I don't want to hold up the bylaw with first reading if we want to go ahead with that. I do have some concerns about locking into a specific interest rate now over this whole period of time, and perhaps the bylaw needs to have some sort of flexibility in that to revisit that. But in any event, that's an issue that can be addressed, and perhaps at a committee of the whole or something, we can kick around this issue a little bit more, but I don't want to hold up the bylaw. If we want to go ahead, it seemed that Ms. Holbeck was suggesting that maybe this bylaw should have included funding for the pool as well, but that seems like another bigger conversation. And so I don't know how she would like to proceed with that.
quick comment?
It's a quick one. Can somebody correct me if I'm wrong? So bylaws, we have to bring it back for reading, but can we not put this as a policy so that it could be changed without having to go? It has to be a bylaw. Okay, good. That's all I want to know.
Okay, so we do have bylaw 1915 with a motion on the floor to approve bylaw 1915 as presented at 1%. If there's arguments for changing the term or the interest rates, or the bylaw could be defeated at the next meeting as well, if council so wishes. But overall, I think if there's no further comments or debate, I'd like to call the motion to question. All in favor? Any opposed? Motion carried. Yeah. And for clarity's sake, for Ms. Director of Finance Holbeck, what specific information would we like her to get so that we're not doing too many back and forths?
So I'm going to tell you what I'm thinking. So I will go back to our investment company and I'll see what length of an investment we can lock into. I'll see how long it can be. I'll see what the rate is. And then I'll look into maybe the bylaw can be for 10 years and then we can revisit it and see if it's working and do a new one for the next 10 years. So I'm going to look into that too, so there's some flexibility.
Okay.
Can I make one request as well? Can I get a little bit of a lesson? can you just give me the basics of how the, like, I don't quite understand how Marco, like, everybody else understands, but I don't understand the whole two sides of the balance sheet, and we're losing this and we're gaining that and we're making this. They're like, we're using all the same words, but yeah.
Do you want to come see me?
Okay.
How about like jelly beans in a
Investments in
jar?
dummies.
And then the other feedback you liked is on the pool. Does council have any feedback they would like to give at this point on how that would look? Councillor Wilson?
The way I remember it is pretty well what Ms. Holbuck said, I think. I know what we didn't say, that's what we're going to do for sure, but it seemed to me that we sort of left it at, that's not a bad idea.
Choose pay cash.
Pay cash for the pool,
reserves.
yes.
Is that the position of everyone on council?
To pay cash and to just write the check and be done with it. Okay, that's not a bad idea. But you do remember that what's the lifespan of this asset now?
Hopefully 50 years.
50, 60 years. Now, that's the part that you're now paying for something that, I love to pay for things, for people, but we're paying for our grandkids' kids' pool. And I just don't think that we're in a position to be doing that right now, unless council as a whole does.
So
I don't think just paying this asset off completely is, I'm willing to work on a deal of sorts, but to just write the check?
So what exactly would you be referring to?
Well, I think we need to borrow a certain amount of it over.
So the question was self-finance or pay cash?
Well, then does it have to be self-finance or pay cash?
Yeah,
we could
why those two options? Why not a
Yeah,
balance?
you
I
know-
agree that this is an asset that provides a service for some generations, a couple of life, and so I think to spread it out over some time by way of financing some of it. I'm not opposed to some of it being by way of a payout in full. I mean, here on the one hand, we're going from the Southwest Industrial where we're looking to finance the whole thing over a 50-year period. And in this, boom, we're just going to pay it all up front. It doesn't,
pretty
those
opposite
two
extremes.
seems kind of contrary.
Councillor Woolston?
I would like to self-finance everything, but I'm afraid of how much we're going to have to pay and what that will hurt us.
And for that very reason, I think there needs to be a balance because at the end of the day, we've got to make these payments each year out of our operating expenses. And there was a report given previously that we've already, we've got some things going right now. And so I'm sensitive to that fact, for sure.
So I'm getting the impression, Ms. Holbeck, that we would like to consider financing on the pool. What terms? I'm not sure.
External financing, that's what we're thinking?
External or internal.
Okay, and then we'll probably, because it's a new facility for the town, I mean, for 2021 budget, there'll probably be some operational cost changes. And then we should probably look at user fees, because that's another way to ensure that there's revenue in the department. Just user fees.
Councillor Edwards?
I'm also wondering, I would like to see us just full off pay the pool off, personally, but I understand that I don't understand balance sheets. We all know that, but we have to make the numbers work and we have to make it the most feasible for everyone. And that doesn't mean just, we have to take the long-term approach to it. So what I'm wondering is partial. So we pay part of it up front and just pay part of it, but we finance the rest. So do both. Pay some of it so that it takes some of the burden off and that we're not paying crazy interest amounts for 50 years. Or, pay half of it up front from our reserves and then finance the rest. So is that a scenario that we could look at? Like, would council be opposed to something like that?
Councillor Monteith first.
When you're talking about just paying it off, when you self-finance or you pay it off, you're losing interest every year for the next 50 years because you don't have that money invested. So it's not a clear cut, we're saving this and we're paying here. No, we're going to be losing every year. So every year, that's going to cost taxpayers some money. So it's not cut and dried that it works like that.
So even though we pay it off, we're still losing.
Well,
Absolutely.
you're losing something. You're losing interest, right?
The pool is a depreciating asset.
You're
As
either
soon as you
paying
spend-
interest or losing interest, and
Whereas-
hopefully they're about the same.
A reserve is not a depreciating asset if it's invested. They're both assets. The pool is just going down in value. A reserve asset hopefully is increasing somewhat. Two different assets.
So to be fiscally responsible then, when I hear pool, it's lose, 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 we really shouldn't have a pool. That's not up for
That's
debate,
not a
but
discussion. Sorry, Councillor Benamos. That motion's been moved. So that gives some feedback.
Yeah.
Chris, I don't know if that's
Yeah.
good enough for you for now.
That's good. I just want to do a friendly reminder to council that when we had our municipal inspection, the inspectors were very clear that they want you to use your reserves. They don't want them sitting there. They want you to invest it in infrastructure and things for your community. They don't think that's a great thing to have a ton of money and investments sitting there and not using it when you have tangible capital asset and infrastructure deficits. So I just wanted to bring that up one more time.
Very good. Okay, so I don't think we need any more discussion or motions on that. So we will move on to bylaw 1917, which is a municipal borrowing bylaw. Director of Finance, Chris Holbeck. So I believe this is a revised budget to incorporate our line of credit that we approved at our last meeting, correct? Bylaw 1917?
Yes, sorry. I got a motion, which was fantastic, and I kept going forward with it. And then I realized when I started to talk to the bank that we have a municipal borrowing bylaw, which has to be amended to include the line of credit because it's like a credit card. It's a line of credit. It's flexible, short-term borrowing. So I have brought a new bylaw forward, and I'm asking council to repeal the old bylaw. And it's not rescind, it's repeal. Please.
Yeah, that's automatically rescinded when we approve bylaw 1917, is it not? So it needs to word, say repealed in bylaw 1917 instead of rescinded? It's 1857 we are rescinding, correct? Repealing, sorry. All right, so a motion from council for first reading on bylaw 1917 with the amendment to repeal bylaw 1857 instead of rescind. Councillor Edwards makes the motion. Any further discussion or questions? Seeing none, called to question on favor. Any opposed? Motion carried. Moving on, if council requesting a motion for second reading on bylaw 1917, Councillor Wolstenholme makes the motion with the amendment. If there's no further questions or discussion, call it to question on favor. Any opposed? If I can request, that's carried. If I can request a motion from council to go to third reading, we would need unanimous consent to go to third reading.
So moved.
Councillor Dressler makes a motion. I will call it to question on favor. Any motion? Any opposed? Unanimously carried. And going on to request a motion from council for third reading of bylaw 1917 with the amendment. Councillor Van Hagemas makes a motion. Any questions, debate? See none, called to question on favor. Any opposed? Motion carried.
Thank you.
Thank you. Moving on to item 7, reserve transfers and estimated ending balances, and I believe this is an information item only, correct?
Information only. So I just wanted to show you that I took our reserve balances at the end of 2019. I put them in for 2020 into the categories that we agreed to, and then I took any transfers to or from reserves based on operating and capital budgets in and out. And then I just do an estimate of what our reserve balances should be at the end of the year. But just so you know, both the 2 capital projects that we talked about are part of the transfers out of these reserves currently in the estimates. So that will change by the next time council sees this, if there's any changes that are made.
Very well, thank you. So motion to approve, accept as information, sorry. Councillor Dressler makes a motion. Any questions for administration? Further discussion? Exciting.
I'm excited.
That's good. Playing with millions of dollars. Okay, call to question. All in favor? Any opposed? Motion carried. Moving on to item number 8, Administration 2020 Tax Recovery Public Auction, Director of Finance, Chris Holbeck.
It's the Chris Show tonight.
Yeah.
All right, so this one is our annual motion by council. Again, this year it's broken up into 2 parts. This one is for council to accept the terms and conditions for when we go to tax recovery public auction, which is normally in the fall. Council will set that date later on. So that's all we're looking for tonight. The second part of this comes back to council. We sent out the letters to any properties that are undergoing tax recovery procedures. They have until the end of the month to make payment arrangements with the town. If they don't make payment arrangements for the taxes that they're in arrears for, then I will go get a fair market value for those properties. And then we come back to council and we get council to pass the properties that are on the public auction list with their fair market values. So that'll come later. But just to give council an update, there's not 5 properties anymore. One has been brought back into current, so there's only 4 on this list now.
Nicely done. So motion to approve the presented terms and conditions of sale for the 2020 Tax Recovery Public Auction. Councillor Van Eymas makes a motion. Any further discussion or questions? Councillor Van Eymas.
So you said they had till the end of the month, but and then you will proceed with appraisal value or fair market value, but they can still pay at any given time, correct?
Yes, so they can pay right up to the morning of the public
Right,
auction and
yeah.
things stop.
Okay.
And does that include the costs that we've incurred in moving the process forward to that point?
Yes, so any costs that we incur from the company that does the administration of these for us is all put on the tax roll for these properties. And the only thing that can be unpaid is the current year's taxes, the 2020 taxes. That's all. Everything else has to be paid. All costs, all taxes. If we've moved utilities over to taxes, all of it.
Thank you.
All right, so there's a motion on the floor. If there's no further discussion, we will call it the question. All in favor? Any opposed? Motion carried. All right, moving on to Alberta Municipal Affairs, MSI Initiative, Director of Finance, Chris Holbeck.
Last one. All right, so MSI this year is a little bit different because everybody's got no money and no cash flow. The province has told us that they will give us our MSI capital when we are shovel ready for our projects. And they are going to contact us monthly to see how we're doing and if and when we need the money so that they don't cut everybody big checks that they don't need to. So at the end of 2019, we still had about $762,000 of just MSI money in the bank waiting for projects because they give you such a big lump sum and then you spend what you do on projects. And we've been under on a certain number of projects, so that's been nice. So we had $762,000 in the bank already. And then our 2020 MSI capital allocation for this year is another 680. So we are going to be good going into our capital projects that are funded by MSI for a little bit. And so I've given the information to CAO Sue Keenan, and when they contact us, I will just keep her abreast of when we actually need them to cut us this check. So that's capital. So on the MSI operating allocation, we are getting about $33,000 this year. Last year, we got about $98,000, and it's reduced because our equalized assessment has increased. And that's a good thing because that means our assessment's increasing. And the MSI operating grant it's called the Municipal Sustainability Initiative. So because our equalized assessment is increasing, we are going offside of how they calculate when you're not sustainable. We're becoming sustainable, so they're taking grant money away from us for operations. So it's kind of a double-edged sword. I just was going to read you a little bit that I got from the capital or the lady who runs the program. So this was her explanation, which I will explain to council so you guys can understand it. In 2019, the $98,603 MSI operating allocation for Fort Macleod included $63,057 of sustainable initiative funding. So there's a portion that's just talks about sustainable initiative funding. And it was based on the town's population and our 2019 equalized assessment. The town was just below 60% of the provincial average. In 2020, there was a small increase in the town's equalized assessment from 349.6 million to 358 million. And this increase resulted in the town exceeding the 60% threshold and no longer being eligible for sustainability initiative funding under that grant. So it's a good thing because our assessment is growing, but on the other end, it put us over the threshold and we no longer receive about that, I don't know, 60-some thousand dollars of MSI operating funding. But it is what it is and we're growing.
Thank you for that information. That helps. So, motion from council to accept this information. Did I do that already? I don't think so.
So moved, Your Worship.
Councillor Dressler makes as information. If there's no further discussion, call the question. All in favor? Any opposed? Motion carried. And item 10 is the item from the consent agenda that was pulled to the main portion of the meeting regarding Alberta Environment and Parks. You had questions, Councillor Dressler?
Most certainly. I did review it and I was reading through it and I just wanted to see in regards to where this falls in our flood management from previous years in regards to the town of Fort Macleod and what we've had on for flood litigation, especially after we received lots of funding in regards to repairs from the previous flood. I know the province is working diligently to do flood management, but I was hoping that maybe Adrian can see whether or not that there should be a little more of a precedence to that, especially when we have our facilities that are right along the river's edge.
So specifically regarding this piece of information, you're wondering if administration has
Gotten better feedback from the province than previous years
on the studies?
on the studies, correct?
Okay. So I believe this is informing us that they have completed technical work. We are sharing draft flood maps and reports from these studies. The process will involve consideration and the information will not be coming for public release until fall of 2020. That's what I'm understanding.
That's correct. The last one that was done prior to our 10-year flood anniversary. And there wasn't a new one done. And the original one that we have that's, as a town of Fort McLeod for the floodplain is quite out of date. So I was wondering if we've gotten any new studies prior to this new study to reflect that, especially going into looking at for disaster management.
So the one we got, I think it was last week that we got from the province, that was the draft. And so we're currently going through it, and then we'll give them our comments, and then it will sort of educate our decisions going forward from a planning and development perspective, but we haven't finalized anything yet.
I thank you very much in regards to that. I know it could have been probably done more with an email, but I kind of wanted to address this because I know some people have raised concerns that are right now when the water level was going up along the Old Man River, especially the golf course that spent and got money for the funding in regards to their intake. So yeah, when water levels go up along the Old Man River, a lot of people hit the big red panic button way before anything else.
Very well. Well, keep us apprised, I guess, if you have anything that council needs to be aware of. That would be appreciated. So I don't believe a motion is required for this, and I do not see any further reports to report on, so I will adjourn the meeting. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.